Du Xunhe, Spring Lament in the Palace. Cursed from early days by beauty, I've grown too indolent to face a mirror. Beauty alone will not appease the emperor, who will school me in beguiling ways. Birds call and chatter in the warm spring breeze. Overhead, the sun casts blossom shadows. Each year, I remember the girls back in Xunhe, those times we gathered lotus flowers together. So we continue. We have almost finished the pentasyllabic regulated poems section, and that's one of the reasons the poems in this section are approximately placed in a chronological order. So this poem is by Du Xunhe, it's the only poem of his in the anthology, and like Zui Tu and Zhang Jiao, which we've seen lately, he is a very late Tang dynasty poet. He was born in 846. He was also from the region of Anhui, like Zui Tu, I think. And we have conflicting informations about his lifetime. We know it took him a long time to pass the examinations. He passed them at 46 years old in 891, so just on the verge of the collapse of the dynasty. And we know that in some way or other he befriended one of the military overlords, one of the military commanders, the Yedushi, an important one, Zhu Wen, who would be the one that, at the beginning of the 10th century, would depose and execute the last Tang emperor, Chaozong, to start a very brief, not very long-lasting dynasty, the later Liang, which was the first of the 5 dynasties, which succeeded each other, with 10 years of tenureship on average during the first half of the 10th century, from about 900 to 950. So Du Xunhe, like the previous poets, lives in a time of dynastic collapse. The empire is falling apart. This is a cycle that dynasties generally follow, and it starts with bad emperors. It starts with an overextended administration that requires heavy taxation. The situation is made worse when local regional powers or landowning elites appear and consolidate their power, and they are an extra layer of extraction and taxation, whether legal or illegal, on the vast majority of the peasantry. This situation can be kept in check in good times, and the taxation and the power of the state allows for some relief of the sufferings of the lower classes. But when unexpected natural disasters compound to this, like the breaking of the dikes, flooding, earthquakes, and famines, plagues, which tend to happen in human history with a relatively irregular but relatively constant as well regularity, this starts a vicious circle. Peasants die and start to mutiny. Peasant rebellions happen. They get away and they stop paying taxation. Most of those revolts are crushed, but the empire is getting weaker and weaker. The central government has less and less means of taxation and of enforcing itself. The local elites or the regional commanders start grabbing power for themselves, and there comes a time when, especially in the aftermath of a very big rebellion, the emperor is left powerless, and he's just a plaything of the most powerful of the warlords that are carving up the empire for themselves. So this is what happened in the late Tang. There is a big rebellion that we've been mentioning in the previous poems that took place, I think, in the 870s, 880s. It took more than a decade to quell, which was the Huangchao rebellion. And this was a very successful peasant rebellion. It devastated large swathes of the country. It produced enormous damage and killing. For example, when the rebels conquered Canton, they massacred all the foreign population. And this peasant army managed to reach the capitals. It took and sacked Chang'an and held it for some months, forcing the then ruling emperor Shizong to run away to Shu. And again, this rebellion was defeated, but in its aftermath, the country was, completely devastated and divided into warlords, and the remaining 1 or 2 Tang emperors were just puppets in the hands of warlords. Okay, so having given that background explanation of the context in which these poems take place, And having given some information about Du Xunhe, let's talk a little bit about this poem. Now, this poem does not really talk about all those contextual elements that we've been talking about. There's no direct or indirect presence, apparently, in this poem of all the hardships and all the warfare that are taking place when the poem is being written. Spring Lament in the Palace. So what's the topic of this poem? The topic of this poem is the ennui, the melancholy sadness of an imperial concubine or wife who is not being visited by the emperor. Now, this is a perennial topic in Chinese poetry ever since there exists a court with a king and concubines. So the emperors got to marry many women, and apart from official marriages, they had, this big hierarchy of primary, secondary wives and concubines and so on. And of course, the emperor doesn't have, no emperor, no king would probably have enough strength or will to visit all of his wives and concubines. So some of them are, they languish, forgotten in some palaces or old quarters of the imperial palace. Now this, as I said, is a very regular topic that appears in poetry and in prose. We have examples from the Han Dynasty, for example. But this type of subject matter, which is, it was perceived by the Confucians before and after the time of Du Xunhe as a decadentist, as a decadent subject matter, frivolous, just about a woman, a beautiful woman in a luxurious setting, with a bit of a voyeuristic pleasure for the reader in gazing into this imperial concubine who is secluded away from normal gaze of the people. She's only for the emperor. So this type of poetry, we're describing a beautiful, abandoned concubine in a luxurious setting, suffering from ennui. This was especially a popular topic during the period of disunion in the 6th century, especially during the Liang dynasty. There arose a new view of poetry, which is called the palace style poetry, Kung Ti Shi, also represented in an anthology. It's called New Songs from a Jade Terrace. Now, the attitude towards poetry in these poems is an aesthetic attitude which jarred a little bit with the traditional Confucian view that poetry had mainly a political purpose, and it was mainly a polite way of making political criticism. And, from the Confucian tradition, the idea of art for art's sake is, at the very least, suspicious, probably immoral or non-ethical. In fact, it was generally believed by the Confucians that the production of this sort of aesthetically oriented literature was an indicator of decadence of a dynasty or of a society. So these poems were very typical of that period, of the period of disunion of the 6th century. This type of poetry continued in the early Tang, and again it would be revived in the very late Tang and in the early Song dynasty. In fact, there is a new genre of poetry that appears in the late Tang, which is called the Zhu. We've mentioned it a couple of times. And the Zhu poems they weren't Shi, they had a completely different metrical organization and patterning. But one of the characteristics of the early Zhu is that they were born from the songs of the sing-song girls in the taverns, and they included this type of subject matter as well. So languishing beauties in a palace environment that are unheeded by the emperor. So there's this beautiful, descriptive, luxurious setting and woman, and at the same time this melancholy sadness of abandonment and loneliness. In a way, they vaguely remind me, in some aspects, Petrarchian poetry, in the way in which women, in this case imperial concubines, are objectified. They're described as these pretty sad little objects, like gorgeous dolls in a luxurious surrounding, but sad. So remember, melancholy sadness is always, a quintessential element that is done away in very few of the classical Chinese poems. It's the elegant tone, the elegant attitude. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem as usual, couplet by couplet. Cursed from early days by beauty, I've grown too indolent to face a mirror. So in the first couplet we get the thoughts or the words of the beauty herself. So already from the title we know that it's spring, spring lament in the palace. So somebody, a concubine, the title really already pushes you to the idea of a concubine in spring lamenting in the palace. Autumn is the generally sad season for melancholy, but spring also appears in a lot of poems as a sad season, because spring, by the cosmological speculations of the Chinese, is the time of renewal, the time of love, the time when birds and all nature seems to join together in love. But here, this love is denied. This appears a lot in Chinese poems. A woman lamenting that it's spring, but her husband or lover is absent. So she cannot follow the season. No, she cannot follow the cycle of the seasons. Love is denied to the human couple. So the first couplet, the woman laments, cursed from early days by beauty. So it's paradoxical. Beauty is generally considered something good to have, something good to enjoy. But here it's presented by a curse, because this beauty hasn't helped the concubine, this palace lady, to achieve perhaps what she wanted, a satisfying love relationship. And it has also uprooted her from her land and her roots. So cursed by the beauty, now she's so languid, so indolent, so oppressed by this sort of empty palace life, that she doesn't have even the minimal strength of, gazing at herself in a mirror. So stereotypical languid beauty, that she's just lying as a passive object on the cushions and pillows of a jeweled bed or dormitory, who doesn't have the willpower or the strength to even just pick up the mirror and gaze at it. Second couplet, beauty alone will not appease the emperor. Who will school me in beguiling ways? So the concubine continues speaking, and she says, I am beautiful, but it's not enough. It's a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for attracting the emperor's attention and appreciation. There were many beauties in the palace. I mean, all the concubines and wives were chosen because of their beauty. But one needs to be a seductress. One needs to, in some way beguile or seduce the emperor. Only a few of the concubines or wives managed to do that, and the ones that did were very successful afterwards in, pushing their children to the imperial throne, or getting other privileges and advantages. Third couplet. Birds call and chatter in the warm spring breeze. Overhead, the sun casts blossom shadows. So this indolence and unhappiness is contrasted with the season. The third couplet is the more landscapey, descriptive. And it gives us some signs of the season. One is, the first line shows us an oral element describing the season. The birds are singing. We also have I don't know how to describe it, a tactile element also. The warm spring breeze caressing the birds and everybody else. There is a spring, a warm breeze has come. So we have the sound of the birds, the warm breeze, and a visual element in the next line. Overhead, the sun casts blossom shadows. We can see the sun shining. There are flowers around, and we can see the shadows of the flowers on the ground. So beautiful sights of spring. And yet, the person who is listening, feeling, seeing, does not appreciate them. They're meaningless to her. Each year, I remember the girls back in Xunhe. Those times we gathered lotus flowers together. So the poem ends with a sad reminiscence, a sad translation of the forlorn and abandoned concubine back to her homeland. So we know she's from Xunhe. Xunhe is the extreme southeastern region of China. It would have been relatively a peripheral region during the Tang Dynasty, close to the frontiers of the empire. Actually, it was in previous dynasties when it was more of a frontier region. By the Tang, it was completely, part of the empire. But anyway, it's a conventional image. The girl from Xunhe is the beautiful lady from a border region, and this also connects with one of the most famous Chinese beauties that was from Xunhe, and of which we've read a poem, Shishi, you will remember. We read a poem some months ago by Xunhe, a song of Shishi. She was a very famous Yue beauty who seduced the king of Wu and led to the ruin of his kingdom. And in that poem, we also had a nostalgic reminiscence by the poetic persona of Shishi of her time before becoming a courtesan, when she was washing clothes with her friends, living the simple life instead of the jaded court life. So we get that here as well. So every year she remembers the girls back in Yue, the friends with whom she spent her childhood and with whom she led a relatively simple life. And she remembers specifically one incident, gathering lotus flowers together. So a lot of poems about southern women depict them doing things in the river. The south of China is a more aquatic realm than the north. So fisherwomen, women collecting plants and herbs floating plants from the rivers. In this case, collecting lotus flowers, which are beautiful flower that sprouts in the summer. So this is what she misses. The palace mistress feels no pleasure for her life and for her luxurious ease. She can only sigh nostalgically, thinking about the simple life and the life before she became a courtesan, a concubine really, and she misses that life. So it's a lament. Yeah, she doesn't enjoy this sort of lifetime. So interesting poem. Again, it doesn't reflect much about its time and age, but I think probably was chosen because it's a good example of this sort of jaded beauty in spring, sort of a poem that is, as I said, is pretty common in the Chinese tradition, more in some periods, less in others. And if you really push the machine to the extremes, you could really also make a political, allegorical interpretation for the poem. If you remember when we talked about the songs of Chu, that are from the late Warring States Han Dynasty, in those poems, the poetic persona adopts the role of one of the southern shamans who is trying to exercise and bring about the arrival of a deity, of a male or a female deity. A lot of times it's a male shaman poet trying to bring a female deity with all the overtones of intimacy, love, and sexual relationship with the said goddess. But very early on, this type of poetry that appears in the elegies of Chu wasn't, how could we say, it was bowdlerized. It was polished and adapted to the Confucian worldview of the scholars and of scholarly poetry, and read allegorically. So the attempt of the poet to connect, to meet the goddess or god, is really meant to be understood as an allegory of the courtier trying to get the emperor's attention. The virtuous courtier wants the emperor to listen to him. And you could say the same thing for these poems of languid beauties that are not being visited by the emperor. A scholar official can very well imagine himself or depict himself in the role of an abandoned palace woman, and that the emperor does not visit. So just as a scholar official would lament that the emperor does not pay attention to him.